Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon and welcome. My name's Kirsten Wiley, and I'm here today to introduce and welcome Stephen Levy, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Stephen is here today to discuss his book, In the Plex, How Google Thinks, Works, and Shapes Our Lives. Just over a decade ago, Google's search engine changed the face of the internet. Their profitable ad business shook the traditional media industries to the foundations. From the very beginning, its founders said they wanted to change the world. But who are they, and what did they envision this new world order to be? Stephen Levy is a senior writer at Wired magazine. He has been a senior editor and chief technology writer at Newsweek, and has written on technology for a wide variety of publications, including Rolling Stone, The New Yorker, and The New York Times. He is the author of several books, most notably Hackers and Insanely Great. Please join me in welcoming him to Microsoft. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, Microsoft, for hosting me. It's always great to get back to Redmond and see you folks at Microsoft. Well, I'm actually going to talk about a different company today. In 1998, I think it's the first time I saw the Google search engine, and I think it's probably safe to say, even here, all of you, when you first saw it, were probably pretty impressed, because it did a lot better than the search engines of its day in finding what was out there. And actually, in doing this, I went back in my own files, and I came across an article I had written in 1996 about search. And of course, all the companies at the time were talking about how they essentially solved the problem as good as was going to get. And I talked to Excite and Alta Vista and a couple others. And I remember there's this quote from this guy at Alta Vista that basically just said, well, it's really not a science, it's really an art. It's sort of mystical and basically hit and miss, and we're, and said basically we've done the problems now. It's just basically the artistry part that it really remains to be solved then. And Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the co-founders of Google, didn't accept that wisdom and came across an idea that actually, sort of surprisingly, it was one of those ideas that was sort of floating out there waiting to be grabbed, and that was by somehow getting hold and cataloging the structure of links on the World Wide Web. You can go backwards and use those links and crunch them up in some mathematical way to figure out which sites were important and which sites linked to what, and that would enable you to extract best, most relevant results from a search query. Not only did Larry Page think about this, but there's a guy who was on a fellowship, a postgrad fellowship at Cornell, or from Cornell at IBM Almaden, who thought of it. And there was another guy in New Jersey who was working for Dow Jones News Service who thought of it, and he took it to his bosses, and they said this wasn't very interesting, and we don't really want to bother with it. Interesting, IBM didn't want to patent it when the guy working there came up with it, but it was Larry Page and Sergey Brin who wanted to actually build it into a product, which they did. So I saw it in 1998, was impressed. I mentioned it in Newsweek, where I was working in February 1999, and in October 1999, by then I was sufficiently interested not only in the product, but it became clear to me that this was one of those things which was going to have significance beyond what it was and actually be transformative. And if you think of it, it's like the interstate highway system. It's not just for the cars moving around, but it changes the landscape. Because those cars are moving there, people would build up almost little mini cities around the exit, and to change the geography. In this case, knowing that there was something out there that could locate a website devoted to something obscure, people were more likely to create those kinds of websites. So it changed the whole structure of the web. So I figured this company itself might be interesting, and I wanted to meet these people. So I asked the communications person at the time, this woman named Cindy McCaffrey, who I knew because she had done work at Apple, and I'd worked with her. Can I come by and meet these people? She said yes. And I remember very clearly it was October, and I remember that because in October is Halloween, and when I visited the Google Plex, they had just moved into a bigger building from a small place over a bicycle shop in Palo Alto. Most everyone was in costume. And Larry Page was dressed like a Viking. He had a big fur vest and a hat with two giant horns coming out of it. And Sergey Brin, the other co-founder, was dressed like a cow. He had a big, cow suit with a breastplate with big, disgusting plastic udders coming out of it. And the cow and the Viking took me into a room and told me about PageRank. So for the next 8 years or so, when I was at Newsweek until I left in 2008, Google was one of the prime companies I covered, along with Microsoft and Apple. They became my trilogy of places that I really watched closely and spent a lot of time at. And I thought it'd be interesting to do a book, but around the time of their IPO in 2004, a couple other people were working on books, so I wrote about something else, and was still thinking about it as Google became even more prominent during that decade. And in the summer of 2007, I got an invitation that I felt gave me a key to how I could pursue a book project. Now, Google has this project, or the system called Associate Product Managers. Now, you all know about product managers at Microsoft, and Google, as it got bigger, realized it needed to have its own product managers, which actually isn't a foregone conclusion. In 2001, as Larry Page in particular saw the company was getting bigger, he became very alarmed that there would be this layer of middle management, and he decided to eliminate all management at the company. And the HR person begged him not to do this. You can't do this. This is crazy. And they had just taken on Bill Campbell, who's an esteemed figure in Silicon Valley, the chairman of Intuit, and he was a good friend of John Doerr's, who sent him over to Google to give advice. And Bill Campbell was trying to advise Google against this. And he and Larry had a big fight where Bill would say, people do want to be managed. And Larry said, no, people don't want to be managed. So they actually called in, just as an experiment, some of the engineers who were working there at that point of the day. It was about 8 o'clock at night. There were still a lot of people there. And they asked them, do you want to be managed? Do you want to be managed? And by and large, actually, they said yes. Yeah, we do want to be managed. But Larry went ahead anyway, got rid of all the managers, and they had over 100 people, which was all the engineers in the company at that time, reporting to one person, Wayne Rosing, who was the head of engineering. And that didn't work too well. So they rolled it back and eventually had to have some sort of product managers. But the people they brought in from places like, can I say it, Microsoft, had their own view, a more traditional view of how product management should be done. And Google wanted to do it differently. A product manager really can't set a direction for a product and certainly can't tell an engineer what to do, because the engineers, the coders, really rule at Google there. So they tried to figure out something else. They came up with a scheme where they would pluck people straight out of college or people who are in the workforce for less than 18 months and give them massive responsibility. The very first person in this program was a Stanford graduate, straight out of school, where they brought into the conference room with a ping pong table at that time and said, you're in charge of launching this product we're working called Gmail. So, big responsibility. But they gave them some guidance to these people. And they took them in classes, and it was a 2-year program. The first year you'd do one project, and the second year you'd work in a different team. And midway through the program, the head of this program, the person who thought of the idea, Marissa Mayer, who's a Google executive, would take the young engineers, product managers. They were all computer science majors, but they also had more of an entrepreneurial bent. They weren't pure geek coders. She'd take them on a trip internationally, and they'd go to Google offices at various places in the world, engineering centers. They'd talk to the people there. They'd get a sense for the market in those areas. And they'd also bond as a group, which would be interesting because there would be a network as they moved through the company and presumably became the leaders of the future. So they invited me to come along. I was the first person to be able to tag along on a trip like this, which is unusual because Google's a pretty closed company in terms of letting reporters in to see what's happening. And it was a revelation for me. Even though I'd been covering the company for a number of years, I guess 8 years by that time, I saw a dimension that I hadn't seen before. Now, I visited a lot of companies during my time as a tech writer, and engineering companies have a lot in common, but Google had some of those things in common, but in other aspects it was different. I really felt that the company had, whether it was, intentionally it adjusted itself to this, or it was just a natural consequence of the youth and interest of the employees, but it really throbbed to the rhythms of the internet itself. And the values seemed uniquely suited for the internet. And of course, it had its own unique culture, springing in part from the proclivities of its founders, who both were Montessori school products, and as it turns out, a lot of the traits of that imprint themselves on the company itself. This detesting of authority, and this idea that but you're going to get the most out of anything if you pursue something that's your passion, and you're not forced to do something that's not interesting to you. So this explains to some degree Google's, they call it creative, but some people call it just plain chaos. So I thought it'd be interesting to do a whole book with that kind of access that I had with these people on the trip, so then I could explain some of the products they do, and their directions, and the culture, of course, from that point of view, with that degree of access. And I asked them if I could do that after the trip, and to my pleasure and surprise to some degree, they said yes. Now, their head of communications at that time, a fellow named Elliot Schrag, who's now holds a similar job at Facebook, told me that if I agreed that Google could have veto power, approval over everything in the book, he would give me a badge, and I'd have total access there. So I didn't get a Google badge. But they gave me access to anyone in the company. I could talk to anyone. I could sit in a number of projects in development, and I would keep my mouth shut about it till the book came out. And if a product, for some reason, wasn't going to reach the public, wasn't going to launch before the book came out, then of course I wouldn't write about it. It seemed fair to me to agree not to prematurely launch Google's products, because they let me in to see them there. So I have to say there's one in particular which I'm still waiting to write about, but the disappointment that I have isn't anywhere near the disappointment they have in not getting the product out. So I do want to leave a lot of time for questions. Before we do, I just want to touch on 5 little turning points that I saw in Google's history from researching the company in this way. And some of them are a little less obvious than others. It's well appreciated that PageRank which is the system of analyzing those links, was a big breakthrough that enabled Google to get where it was with a search engine. But something pretty underappreciated was something that happened pretty early in Google's history. I peg it from 1999 to 2001 in terms of the people they hired. Now, this is a very small startup, really, and this started really when they were about maybe 9 or 10 or 11 people, where Larry and Sergey went after the kinds of people that no startup really had the business pursuing. These were PhDs in computers who were attaining a reputation. They were relatively early in their careers, some of them, but some of them were a little farther along, of very distinguished computer scientists. Yet Google went after them and convinced those people to join the company when the company was just starting, had no business model, and just had a cool product there. And they did this in part by force of personality, but also they benefited from the idea that the tech had gone through a trough, and there were all these interesting research labs in addition, particularly the DEC Research Lab, Western Research Lab in Palo Alto, that were going through some hard times, and DEC in particular had been bought by a company which was bought by another company. There were 2 levels of not invented here there. And one guy in particular was sort of a turning point. This guy named Jeff Dean. Has anyone ever heard of Jeff Dean here? Research folks? Almost no one. But among certain folks at that time, he was like a legend, like the smartest guy at DEC. And he came on there because he was really excited by the challenges that Google was going to take in dealing in scale, in big data and innovative ways to process it. And when he got hired in the Valley, there was this like whispering campaign, like, did you hear like this little company hired Jeff Dean? It was like a little basketball team, a local basketball team hiring Kobe Bryant. I mean, how could this happen? And it really flipped the dial, and a lot of people who didn't consider Google wouldn't consider it otherwise, went and got a job there afterwards. And Google actually had a hit list of some of the people they wanted, people who were experts in machine learning and dealing in big data, who they went down, and they were able to fill in a lot of this list there. And what those people did really was they built out what was a graduate student project into something that could really handle a massive scale. They built an infrastructure, they rewrote the search engine, and really changed the direction of the search engine from something that relied very largely on PageRank to something which was a learning machine, which could learn about the environment around it by analyzing user behavior there. So that was an important turning point. The second one, a little more obvious, was when Google figured out how to make money. They came up with this product called AdWords. Now, there was another company which did something similar to what AdWords became. Now, you advertise on Google, of course, you buy a keyword, which is something that people type into the search engine when they're searching for something. And of course, the keyword goes through and Google produces the relevant results. They appear in the middle of the page, and those are the organic search results that's Google's discovered to answer your query. But now, of course, now we see on the right a list of other things which are paid ads. Now, these ads don't get there by the traditional advertising model of saying, I want to show you this, and and I'm buying space on this page. Instead, they're conducted by auction. So every time you type in a keyword, not only does Google go through its indexes and use its algorithms to extract those search results, but it conducts an auction of people who have put in bids for those keywords and say how much they're willing to pay when someone clicks on the ad that appears if they win the auction. But winning the auction doesn't mean that you necessarily paid the highest amount for the auction. And this is where Google veered off from a competitor named Overture, which had figured out first how the idea of auctioning off keywords. Instead, Google had another factor that it mingled in with the calculation of who would win the auction, is how good the ad was. So what happened was they had a way to figure out how many people, well, there's some people nodding here, maybe in Microsoft's ad system. So how many people were going to click on the ad? It had to make that prediction. And it had a lot to do with sophisticated math and economics and statistics to make that prediction. But if it did it well, then what would happen is it would give a big incentive to the advertiser to make better ads. And even though some people who couldn't compete as well, who just wanted their ad to appear on the page by paying the highest and were very frustrated when their ad wouldn't appear there, they might not have been as happy, but the users were happy. And indeed, Google regularly tests their system to see if the users like it, if the users like the ads. They show people a certain percentage the results without ads. Then they have a big control group, of course, of people who see the ads, and people search more with the model with the ads. So Google constantly is testing to make sure people like the ads. And this turned out to be so fantastically successful that the Google's financial problems, which had been starting to get a little serious, the venture capitalists were wondering what was going to happen, evaporated almost instantly when this was implemented. So the next few years, Google engaged in what was called internally as the hiding strategy. Google was very afraid that one company in particular would notice how well its system was doing and decide to compete in a very big way. Now, this company was one where its new CEO had some experience, and it hired Eric Schmidt to be its CEO, and he was a veteran of the browser wars, and his side had not done too well in the browser wars because he was, on the Netscape side, and the other company, I won't keep you in suspense, it was Microsoft, had done pretty well with its browser there. So Eric was very careful not to what he called moon the giant, and somehow engage Microsoft, and he was very careful to keep its financial results secret, which he had to do till the IPO. Interestingly, the co-founders of Google, Larry and Sergey, have a different idea of competition. They just want to go where they want to go, and they really don't care who's occupying the space where they want to move into. So it was an interesting thing to see when I looked into the origin of Google's browser, Chrome, that very early on, Larry and Sergey wanted to do a browser, and Eric kept stalling them, saying, not time yet, not time yet, not time yet, until they finally did do a browser. It came out in 2008. The third turning point I want to mention was when Google got YouTube. Now, it's a very valuable franchise. Google paid a lot for it, and I think it worked out pretty well. But the point I want to make is kind of interesting because Google had its own product at that time called Google Video. and he was developing this product, trying to make it popular. And it was just around the time that these guys in San Bruno were coming up with this thing called YouTube. They had a little place over a pizza shop. There was like 3 guys, and they were competing with this big company, Google, which it was in the middle of the 2000s, and Google was now very successful, a public company doing very well. Now, it's possible to go back and do forensics on this competition because there turned out to be a very big lawsuit against YouTube, and then when Google bought the company, Google and YouTube, by Viacom, which charged massive copyright infringement there. And as a result of the discovery process, all these wonderful emails, a journalist's dream, I might say, became available. And so you could actually see how YouTube worked and how Google Video worked and how each team developed their product. So the Google Video team, a lot of the emails deal about some slide decks they're making to present to the executives, to explain what they're doing, to sell the product, to get more resources. And then there was a lot of emails talking about the copyright strategy, about working with lawyers and other people to make sure that they were on the right side of the law there. And the person in charge of Google Video actually was a lawyer, and she had worked in the entertainment industry, so she was very concerned about this. Then you look at the YouTube videos, and it's like copyright schmoppyright. We just want videos on there. Let's just go, have a party. And clearly it was those few guys who weren't constrained by being a public company, by being a big company, by convincing their bosses that they had to do something, which vanquished Google there. So to me, that was an early sign. Google's size was going to constrain what it did. And to this day, this is a big problem at Google, and one which really plagues Larry Page in particular. So now that Larry is the CEO, he's going on one of his periodic reorganizations to try to make Google think like it's a smaller company, act like it, and essentially defy gravity. That's very important to him. So I'll give one more point, turning point in there, and this is something I spent a lot of time working on in the book, which was China. Now, the Google China experience to me was fascinating and really the centerpiece of the book in a certain way, because I sort of follow the moral story of Google. Google started with very explicit ideals. Larry Page and his partner Sergey like to talk about how they're in this to make the world a better place. And when the company went public, they actually made a statement, and Larry wrote this, that sometimes, and he warned shareholders of this, sometimes we're not going to chase the most profits if we think it's going to get in our way of serving humanity, right? Imagine telling shareholders that. But that was their stake in the ground. They were going to be a moral company. So along comes this opportunity to go into China. It's the most exciting marketplace in the world. More people are going to use the internet in China than are people who live in the United States. It's clearly someplace that every technology company wants to play. And of course, Microsoft was already there with its engineering center led by Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. So in order to get into China, though, in order to put its search engine in China, Google had to make this horrible, horrible compromise. They had to agree to censor their search results according to what the Chinese government didn't want in there. Now imagine this. This is a company that spent every fiber of its being in delivering the best possible results when its users typed something into the search box and wanted the answers there. Now it was being asked not only to withhold results that might be the most relevant results, but to do it into service of an oppressive government trying to stifle its citizens, stifle the freedom of its citizens there. And that's a tough pill to swallow, especially for Sergey Brin, one of Google's co-founders, who had come over as a child with his family, escaping oppression in Russia. So this is not an abstraction to him. Yet, they did that. And they say, and Google says, and I think I'm going to take them for their word on this, that the reason why they made that move into China wasn't simply because, well, the profits are too great, but they actually felt that they would be doing good. They constructed sort of a moral spreadsheet, where in some cells of the spreadsheet, things were way in the red because well, obviously they have to censor, and that's a very negative thing. But then other cells of the spreadsheet were positive. They were in the black. They thought that just by spreading information more within China, they would do a service to its people and somehow encourage people to seek more information. They would also tell people when they were filtering the search results. So people might look at the bottom of the page and say, wow, my government's preventing me from seeing things. I should push back on my government and ask them to change the policy there. So essentially, Google was asking China or thinking that it was going to change China. Well, what happened was that China changed Google. That the compromise they made wasn't the end of what China asked them to do. So during the years they spent there were more and more demands. Government officials would say, could you take that out about me? There's a news item which is embarrassing. Please take it out of your indexes. Other times the Chinese government made larger demands. After the Olympics in 2008, Google thought those demands might subside, but they didn't. And at one point, China even asked them to take out search results, not just in the Google's China operation, but the Chinese language website that people all over the world can use. So that was tough. When I went to China, though, I was surprised at some other things that I hadn't known, really hadn't been out in the press before. For instance, the number one concern among the engineers in China had nothing to do with censorship, had nothing to do with some of the unhappiness of their bosses, that Google wasn't giving them more money to market to fight their competitor Baidu. But it was they didn't have access to the production code that engineers all over the world at every other Google engineering center could see, could work with in order to improve Google search and other products and develop new products. They felt that Google didn't trust them. And indeed, when I asked the executives at Google about the policy, that was the case. They didn't trust them. It's not like they didn't trust them individually. They were worried that their families might come under pressure, or there might be someone who was a secret party member who was out to take things. It was a unique thing that Google put Google at odds with its employees, and it turned out to be a big cultural gaffe. Now, this gaffe became complicated even more when Google discovered that its government relations person, the very important person in the Beijing operation, because this person has to deal with the government, negotiate sometimes how much things have to be censored. The government can ask for 10 things, and it's up to the GR person to winnow it down to 7 or 6 or maybe even lower, and also to make sure that Google is on the good side of the government for its license, which is not a trivial task to get there. This woman, as it turns out, had given iPods, not Zunes, as gifts to government officials during Christmas one year. And this actually is against the law. There's a law against bribing government officials in different countries. And when Google found this out, they were shocked and actually had to fire this person there. And this, they didn't really prepare the people in China to hear this, because in the Chinese culture, this didn't seem like such a horrible transgression. And then it became worse when Google, following the letter of the law, hired this white-collar investigation firm to come in there and do an investigation of what had happened there. And these people were former prosecutors, very tough, and the people in China felt that they were being treated like thieves. Meanwhile, the people in China were perceiving that some of the Google executives in Mountain View had begun to lose faith in the experiment. Maybe they had recalculated their spreadsheet and figured out that this censorship was not worth the effort. So it was like a rump group in Mountain View of executives who are now quietly urging Google to reconsider its policy. So in the end of 2009, when an attack occurred on Google's servers, not just in China, but in the United States, and property was stolen, and the accounts, the Gmail accounts, of users around the world were broken into, of dissidents, then Google came to grips finally with the bigger picture there. These hackers, dark side hackers, I don't want to use the word hackers in solely pejorative sense. I wrote a book about that. But these dark side hackers almost certainly were in the service of the Chinese government, if not working for it. And that led to a debate where Google decided ultimately, that it was going to pull stop censoring the search results, which essentially meant they were pulling it out from China. China was never going to allow Google to operate by censoring the search results. So that was a traumatic thing for the company. But in a sense, it ended on a high note because Google got to reestablish its moral mojo in what it did. And it actually came a good time in a publicity sense for Google, because at that point Google was suffering a lot of scrutiny and criticism because it had grown from a small company to a big company. It had gained a lot of power, and people start questioning its power in the search market and whether it was afoul of the antitrust laws, and they were questioning its privacy policies there. And that's something that Google is going to be having to face, I think, really throughout the rest of its history. And it's interesting to see how they deal with it. Because Google, as I said, just tries to get itself in the mode where it thinks of itself like a small company, so it could be nimble, so it could act quickly. And this is the nature of the reorganization that Larry Page is doing in the company. And I think intellectually they understand that they're a big company and that they're subject to this kind of scrutiny, and that people are going to be suspicious because it has so much information about them. But on the other hand, I don't think viscerally that sinks in there. And the final turning point there I'll mention is the book project, where Google wanted to scan all the books in the world and put the content of the books in its indexes and make that available to people in a single click, from any book ever printed there. Not the entire contents of the book, but if someone wanted to get to something that was only in My Book Packers, then they could type it in and that book would appear, or some book that was published in 1922 that no one ever heard of. And Google felt this was so great for civilization that no one could possibly launch a serious objection to it, to the point where it would stop that project. When in fact, Google got sued, there was a settlement, and the settlement was came before Judge Denny Chin in New York City. And an array of people testified against Google, who one would have thought would have been their natural allies. There were not only people who were big advocates of the spread of information, but there was even the science fiction writers lined against Google. And that was a low blow, because people at Google love their science fiction. And there was even a lawyer who was representing Arlo Guthrie who testified against it. And I just thought, how has it come to this, that these lovely, cuddly Google guys now are the foes of Arlo Guthrie? So that showed, I guess, where the concerns where Google is now at this point in the second decade of the 21st century there. It was, I have to say, though, a pleasure to work on the book, because Google, like Microsoft, is a great company and one we look to make possible the bounty of technology. And one thing I've learned about Larry Page in talking to him is that ambition is really at the core of his values. And not ambition to get ahead in a Sammy Glick sense, but ambition to the idea that people should take on big tasks. He really believes, I guess as you folks do, that technology makes possible things that we were all brought up to think were impossible at one point. And we've never been in a position to make the impossible within grasp as we are now. And he's personally disappointed that more people don't take advantage of this time in history and what we can do to take on big, audacious tasks there. And he's particularly unhappy when people at Google don't take these things on. So that to me is a sign that maybe under Larry we're going to see some unexpected things, risky moonshots, as they call them at Google, that may or may not work out. Anyway, thanks a lot, and I'm very eager to take your questions. Okay, over there. We're going to just shout out, or do we have a mic?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I hope this is loud enough. I wanted to ask you about the origins of Google is fascinating, hiring the PhD scientists. So it seems to be in their DNA, just the whole engineering and the algorithmic, scientific-based user service. And given the new trends, people are seeking information in different ways now, through their friends, through their social networks. And how well positioned do you think Google is in handling this challenge? I know they've done the +1 thing, but I mean, really, I think there's a lot of catch up there to do. Everyone talks about go beyond the 10 blue links, right? How well positioned do you think they are, and what do you think they should do to kind of counter that the whole movement?
Right. Did everyone hear that? Okay. So it's this question about the social challenge that Google faces now. And almost in the language that you used, I think the people at Google are discussing this and working on this problem now. They realize that this has been a gap in what they've done. Now, Google has had a number, and I get into it in the book, a number of projects in the social space over the years. And for one reason or another, I don't think it's one single reason, but for different reasons, each one has either flopped or not fulfilled his expectations. They had a product called Orkut, which actually came out just around the same time frame as Facebook. And in everywhere in the world except India and Brazil, now they're fading in India, it didn't work. And that was in part because they didn't give it the resources it needed when it was too slow, and they were changing the technology platform, but they just didn't put enough into it to fulfill its potential. Another point, they bought this company called Dodgeball, which is a location-based system where people can share their location with each other, and it left it to fester. And the guy who started Dodgeball went off and founded Foursquare. I also found out that during the time Dennis Crowley, the Dodgeball guy, was at Google, at one point he thought of an idea that actually was exactly like what Twitter is now. And he brought that up, and no one had much of an interest of it at Google. They didn't see the world through those lenses now. I have to say that that's different now. They do see that there is an increasingly growing corpus of information, much of it held by Facebook, about what people like and who people are in contact with, what people are doing. And this is information because Facebook's a walled garden that Google can't get at. Their mission is to access all the world's information, right, and organize it. And this is a crucial piece of information that they can't get hold of. And Google is now in sort of a Facebook panic on how we're going to respond to that. And I wrote in the book about this big project they're working on. The code name is Emerald Sea, which is their giant social initiative. And we're seeing some things come out of that. We haven't seen everything come out of that yet. And the Emerald Sea name came, I'm not sure whether the picture came first or someone Googled the image search, but when the first thing comes up in image search, when you type in Emerald Sea into Google, is a painting, a 19th century painting by this artist named Alfred Bierstadt. And it shows a giant wave, tsunami-sized wave, about to crash into the shore. And there's like a little sailboat caught just in the nook of the wave there. It looks like certainly this sailboat's a goner, right? Whoever's on the sailboat is out of it. But it was explained to me by the head of this project that, this is what social is for us. It's either going to wave, we're going to ride high, or it's going to engulf us. So they are definitely engaged, and we'll have to see how well they do on that. Okay, way back in there.
So I guess I'm curious though, because you said, Page wants to do these kind of like moonshot things, and it's also been, there's the social stuff you talked about, it's widely rumored they were trying to buy Groupon, and now they're trying to build a competitor, and it's kind of hard for me to see local coupon advertising as sort of a moonshot thing, I guess.
Right. Well, I would characterize that differently, and I think, and when I discuss the social thing in the Plex, I talk about the perception among some Google people that this isn't what Google does best. With one person who was developing social products for Google a couple of years ago said, what we don't want to be in and what we're not good at is chasing taillights, doing what other companies do. He said, and he had some contempt for it. He says, drunks chase taillights. That's not for us. So what Google's good at is going forward, is building cars that drive themselves. And so now Google is in an awkward position of basically chasing someone's taillight there. And to the degree that they come up with something that's totally new and not a Facebook clone, I think that'll be in their comfort zone there.
They miss this stuff sort of in part because of that contempt, that they don't think this is kind of worthy of their talents, or it's not really what they're interested in?
Well, it didn't seem like a googly pursuit. Maybe some people, I think the people who are most regretting not seeing that are the people in search who realize how that information can be valuable in search results. So now, Google has already rolled out the social search, and it doesn't quite affect the results yet, the rankings, but I think it's just one step before they take the information which people can enter voluntarily about a website that they like it, and then it'll show up when their friends or contacts or people they follow on Twitter will search for the same queries, and that comes up there. And right now, it just flags it, like someone you know or someone you follow on Twitter likes this site, but it's inevitable that they're eventually going to use it to affect the rankings, and then they'll test the heck out of it to see whether that delivers more relevant results. Okay, up front here.
Yeah, so I know they're looking at the businesses, right? They're trying to sell the Gmail to enterprises and that kind of thing. Are they going to? What's their culture around that? Do you think it'll support the kind of dual focus on like search and consumer and the business space as well? Are they going to be able to handle that?
Google, they have a big effort, obviously, into selling its apps into the government, into their marketplaces, and obviously the people involved in those divisions take it very seriously. I never felt it was super core to Google there. The passion and the urgency, let's say, that they're approaching social has really yet to be seen. So this is just my perception of them satisfying this. It's definitely something that they're engaged competitively in, but I don't know how high it is on their stack to get that through there. But certainly they react with indignation when people say that they don't follow the rules, or they're misrepresenting their security status in doing that. And maybe that's a way that some people could be mooning the giant in Mountain View. So maybe people could be careful there. Yeah.
And what can you tell us about their view of the competitive landscape, especially in terms of Apple in the mobile space, Microsoft in terms of commercial services, and Facebook in terms of search?
Well, aside from the Facebook thing, it's interesting, and I alluded to this before, that their view of competition is not so traditional. It's not a strategic one where they're mapping out the world and playing this game of Risk, like I think you guys, your leaders might do here. There, it's more of we're just going to bomb into a place, and if we see an opportunity to do this, and we're not concerned who's in there. I tell the story about how when they were developing Google Voice, and some people said, well, you're going to get every phone company against us, and these are people that are important for us, or Android there, and they say, well, who cares? These people really hate us anyway. Let's just go in there. And for the other classic example, of course, is the relationship with Apple. That for a while it looked like Google and Apple they were like Humphrey Bogart and Claude Rains in Casablanca, the arm in arm going off together. Steve Jobs was going walks with Sergey Brin, and they were entirely complementary companies with no conflicting products. Google decides to get into the phone space, which if you consider, it really has to, because I don't know if the day is quite here yet, but it's pretty soon when more searches are going to be conducted on phones and mobile devices than they are on desktop computers and laptops, right? So it's sort of important to Google to be in that in a big way. But in any case, they didn't do it in a graceful way to make their partner feel included in this. And Steve Jobs wound up feeling betrayed by Google, and that relationship between those two companies is really in shards. Okay, yeah, back there.
How do you see the iPhone versus Android versus Windows Phone coming along? Will it be a remake of Windows versus Mac?
Well, it's not that clear an analogy. In some sense, so far it has been, in that by building this ecosystem and not being a one company, complete enchilada solution, Google's managed to outsell the iPhone there. But I think a lot of people probably wouldn't want to trade Apple's position now with Google's. It's unclear. Certainly, Google financially is a beneficiary of the success of Android, even though it doesn't charge for it. Those things are really Trojan horses for Google Search and all their products there. But they're always a little behind on the quality there, and now they're dealing with problems that come when different suppliers start to fork in the system, and Android might be split in a way where it makes it more of a challenge for developers to do apps there. So that's something that they always have to watch there, and it's going to be difficult. Maybe for that reason, it won't be such a classic matchup like Windows and Mac was. Yeah.
What's Google afraid of?
Well, aside from the Facebook thing, Google's afraid that the next paradigm comes and they're not there. Really, that's where the innovator's dilemma, right? Just ruins great companies. The companies that are in control of one paradigm, and then another paradigm comes on, and not only are they slow to adopt what's new, but they find themselves in a position of defending the old because that's very profitable there. And I think that's a concern. They're also concerned that they're not going to be able to accomplish what they could because of the size, because of the bureaucracy. So right now, like a lot of companies, they're really concerned about retaining employees, bringing in new ones there. But their hiring process almost self-selects for the kind of people who have zero tolerance for bureaucracy, right? So those are the people who are most unhappy in a big company that has these Dilbert-esque methods that drive them out and make them crazy. And it's very easy, if you were in Silicon Valley, if you're fed up with that stuff and you're a really talented person, to walk out and start your own company or go to Facebook. Yeah.
Do you get the impression between the lesson they learned with the YouTube incident, where a small company that might be small enough to ignore the law could actually beat a dedicated large company, combined with Page coming back to the leadership, that there's going to actually be kind of an increase in Google's willingness to kind of skip over the legal stuff if they become convinced whatever they're doing is worth it? I mean,
What do you mean skip over the legal
well,
stuff?
just
like break the law?
To break the law. I think whatever they're doing is more important than what the law seems.
Well, one thing I did find interesting about Google, and it's sort of unique in my experience, both in the publishing world and covering the companies in the tech world, was even when they hired their lawyers, they wanted a different kind of person. In most places, the job of your legal team is to see what the law is and then tell you no, to make sure that you don't violate the law. At Google, they have their lawyers. This is what they're there for, is to figure out a way to say yes, to not get in the way of doing what you want to do. Now, to find a legal way to do it, and the idea is not to get people put in jail or wind up being on the wrong side of billion-dollar lawsuits, but their tilt is towards how do we make this happen, as opposed to how do we stop horrible lawsuits from happening.
But you read the Viacom documents, and it was pretty clear they concluded, as long as YouTube's willing to kind of disregard copyright, we're never going to win.
Right. Well, I think that, it was easier to do it to bring in an outside company, but then they did bring in the technology to identify infringing works. And right now, the way that the company operates, there aren't those complaints that were there in the early parts of the company, and they're working hard to be partners now. Yeah.
Where do you think Google will be in 10 years?
I don't really know the answer to that. I think it could go either way. If some of these long shots pay off, Google could be a different kind of company. They could be a big company in an area where none of us suspect they're even going to go right now.
Do you think they might buy Verizon?
Verizon? Yeah. Oh, that's a new one on me. That would be interesting. Well, I'll tell you what I do think. So I wrote about this Spectrum auction that they competed in. And so it was fascinating because Google was very unhappy that these big carriers had all this control over what can go on in a network, how business is done with phones and things like that. So they asked the FCC to auction off this next big chunk of spectrum, this valuable chunk of spectrum, in a way where it will be more open. And in order and the FCC agreed, but in order for that to take hold, someone would have to bid the minimum in this auction. Otherwise, the government would conclude that no one's going to pay what this spectrum is worth with these restrictions. So now we're going to have to re-auction it, and with the same old depressive ways of the previous one. So someone had to bid, was it $3 billion, some amount for that spectrum. So Google decided it was going to participate, and its strategy was to just bid enough to make the auction official, and then someone would bid over it, and it would be off the hook, because Google wasn't ready to be a phone company, right? So the auction occurs, and Google's bidding, it occurs in rounds. It's a little complicated. So you have to bid in a round, and then the round ends, and then you bid again. So Google's the bidder in every round, and it has to top itself to make sure the auction is still going. And then the moment comes where Google has to bid over the reserve. And at that point, the auction is official, and if no one bids over Google, they're stuck with it. They're the dog that chases the car, right? So they have a meeting, and they say, well, should we go ahead with this bid? And the policy guy, the guy who's the expert in the telecoms, who has been pushing this all along, says, and they say to him, what are the odds that we're going to get top there? And he says, 87%. They said, that's pretty good. We're going to make the bid. Afterwards, he told me, I said, why'd you say 87%? He said, well, I just picked a number which sounded official. They love numbers, right? So they make the bid, and now they're sweating it out. A day goes by, 2 days, 3 days. Finally, Verizon tops the bid. They're off the hook. What happens then is Larry says, why don't we keep going? And they finally convince him, no, we're not ready, we can't do that. I think next time they'll keep going.
Do they kill any projects that may be a threat to their core search advertising business, or do they have that sort of mentality, or do they just kind of let things go?
That's a great question. Would they cannibalize AdWords? It's a tough one to cannibalize, wow. But I think if they were convinced, if Larry was convinced that what was the next thing down the pike was going to be better, he would do it. Essentially, they did it with AdWords. They had a very successful model of more traditional advertising that on one side of the page, on the right side of the page, they were doing this AdWords model, but on top of the search results, they were selling traditionally to big companies that just bought it, by impressions. They were spending a lot of money. It was $300 million a year they were making. At that time, was a lot of money on that. And then they decided to end that. Now, these are called the premium ads on top, and they had a period they called premium and sunset, where they got rid of a very profitable model in terms of to implement the up-and-coming model. So I think maybe yes. And that's the sign of a pretty good company. Apple's an expert at cannibalism like that. Yeah.
How is it design perceived at Google?
Design?
Yeah.
Well, there's actually ongoing simmering design wars at Apple. Every couple of years, some designer stomps out of there saying, this place doesn't understand artists. And Larry in particular, he doesn't like animations or swooshy stuff. And people sometimes criticize Google for its utilitarian look, or the idea that the look is determined by relentless testing of every element of design. So they'll do A/B testing on how many pixels are in a line, and one point it came out they tested 57 different shades of blue on a product there. But it became clear a lot of designers were wondering, well, really, what is our design aesthetic all about? Until finally someone explained it to them that our products have to be made to look like almost machines design them, because implicitly we want to convey that we're not biased, that when you get into our search results, there's no editorializing of going in and what makes them there. So we want to create the impression that this is a company without bias, and that's why we want to have these neutral looking interfaces there. Yeah.
You think the death of Google Health is greatly exaggerated?
Well, it seems underground to me. I haven't heard a lot about that. I think it could be back. I mean, it's one of those areas where it's so in their wheelhouse that it's tough to imagine that they don't want to play. But it's a tough nut to crack, and their priorities went elsewhere when it didn't work too well. Google's not that great at reviving something when the first response isn't that good. That's a weakness of the company there. Yeah.
What have you observed about how Google deals with privacy?
How Google
deals with privacy?
Deals with privacy?
Yeah.
Well, they have a big privacy infrastructure there. And the privacy people are concerned not only about the degree of privacy they give to the users, but the perception now that Google has in privacy. So I wrote about this product they did called Google Goggles, where when you take a picture of something and it acts like a search query, where it searches by the image for something. They had the capability to build face recognition into that, but it was turned down because they felt it was too creepy. The people would react negatively to it, and it would give Google more trouble than it was worth. Now, in some other aspects, though, I feel that some of the leaders of Google are, while they're concerned about privacy, don't really understand the degree to which people in general are worried about Google in this. And, it's a typical thing where, because they feel their motives are pure, as far as they can see in self-examination, that they don't understand why anyone would have a problem with them. Yeah.
So it seems that in many ways, Google today is kind of like Microsoft in 1997.
You said it.
Maybe not paying as much attention to the government as they should. Just word that they're not very friendly to their partners. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the two companies compare after following both for so long.
There are definite parallels, as you mentioned there, and both are, in terms of the. I think, as I said before, I do distinguish. Both have partner problems, but it comes from a different point of view. My impression at Microsoft is that people sat there and figure, here's our competitors. How do we win over our competitors, right? Which is the way businesses traditionally have done it. In Google, it's more, here's an opportunity to do something new in a market, or use our infrastructure and our talent to come up, and move into a market, and they really aren't concerned with who is and who isn't in there. In terms of the government, very, very, very similar. Though I have to say I'm a little surprised at the degree to which you folks here at Microsoft underappreciate the irony of pushing the government and the EU to file antitrust against Google. So I covered Microsoft a lot during the 90s there, and talked to your chairman at the time a lot about that. And I would have thought that Bill Gates would not have wished on his worst enemy what he was experienced then, and clearly he does. Yeah.
I'm interested into any thoughts that you have around Google Buzz and GoogleGÇÖs. I work for the enterprise services part of our business, and if we were to decide to withdraw a service, we'd do it in a certain manner, and I think be more responsive to customers' needs or wishes. Do you have any insight into how and why they made those decisions, and whether with hindsight they would choose to do things differently?
I still don't quite understand what happened with GoogleGÇÖs. I mean, now, especially since they come up with their the Chrome operating system, which seems Gears, or something Gears-like, would be pretty useful to have a computer which really doesn't work when it's not connected to the internet. It seems odd to me. So maybe I haven't done enough reporting as to why Gears went away, but I don't.
What I find interesting about that is they really announced sort of I think someone mentioned it at a conference, and then subsequently in a blog post. And if we said we were ending offline access to things, I mean, there'd be a huge furore.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting how they did it, and the fact they didn't anticipate that was going to be an issue, especially now that they're selling to enterprises.
I'm actually surprised it's not a bigger issue, because that did surprise me. The other thing you mentioned was Buzz. Well, Buzz, there's a case where they this case of myopia, when they tested the product. They have this project. Do you use the word dog food here at Microsoft? Yeah. So they during the dog food process. Do you also have fish food? Is that part of the? So fish food is when you test the product within the group that creates it, and then dog food is when you give it more widely in the company. When it's the dog food process there. So that's a new animal reference that you guys can integrate into your works here. But during the dog food process, when it was tested within the company, eating your own dog food, they had this feature, which they thought was a wonderful feature, to save people all the hassle and time-consuming effort to build a social network. When you had a new product there, it would do it automatically from your contacts, right? And when you were testing it internally, that was no problem, because you were only using it with other people within Google. And there weren't people that you wanted to hide on your email list when they did that. So they were totally unprepared for the outcry that would come when these instant social networks came up. And some of your contacts learned who else you were in contact with, which, if you think about it, isn't necessarily a great thing there. And they actually fixed that fairly quickly, but the damage to the product was such that it's a stain, as someone told me at Google, that it's going to remain forever. And essentially that product has a greatly diminished chance of ever being picked up there. I actually went to the rehearsal of the Buzz launch, and they had a bunch of Google's PR people playing the press. They were like doing a sort of like a mock Q&A session, MOOC Q&A session, and they asked all these questions about, like, Facebook and things like that, and not one person asked the privacy question, which was interesting. But to be fair, in the real launch, not one reporter asked the privacy question.
Let's just do one more question.
Okay, one more back there.
How much of their focus on operational excellence comes from the top, or is that sort of?
I think a lot comes from the top there. And I think one thing they have been successful of is, even though it's this big company and most people in Google haven't spent personal time with Larry and Sergey, that they do a good job of channeling their values there. And operational excellence is one of them. Another is speed and scale. It's, speed is mom at Google, and scale is apple pie. So, those are things that everyone in the company all knows about there. Anyway, great questions as I expected. Thanks so much for coming. And I'm signing.